Rosinka Chaudhuri is Director and Professor of Cultural Studies at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. She was inaugural Mellon Professor of the Global South at Oxford University 2017-18 and has held visiting positions at King's College London, Delhi University, Cambridge University, and Columbia University. Her books include Gentlemen Poets in Colonial Bengal, Emergent Nationalism and the Orientalist Project, Freedom and Beefsteaks, Colonial Calcutta Culture, and The Literary Thing, History, Poetry, and the Making of a Modern Cultural Sphere. She's also edited a number of volumes like Derozio, Poet of India, a definitive edition, the Indian Postcolonial, a history of Indian poetry in English, an acre of green grass and other English writings of Buddhadeva, Bose, and a series titled Social Science Across Disciplines, which is co-edited with Professor Partha Chatterjee. Most recently, she's also edited, annotated, and introduced George Orwell's Burmese Days for Oxford World's Classics as part of their Orwell series. Many articles, reviews, and book chapters have been published nationally and internationally, while her translation of Rabindranath Tagore's letters, titled Letters from a Young Poet, received an honorable mention in the category of A.K. Ramanujan Prize for Translation, South Asia, at the Association for Asian Studies Book Prizes 2016. So as we can see, her work is extensive and it has charted, as Madhumita rightly pointed out, a wide expanse from literature to history, to cultural history, literary history, and so on and so forth. Today, her talk is titled Civil and Political Liberty and the Happiness of Indians, Calcutta, 1843. I wouldn't take a long time in sort of reading out the abstract, but she would be talking about the particular historical milieu, as she says in the abstract, of 1843 and the formation of the first Indian Political Association, consolidating civil and political activities of the inhabitants of Calcutta. A truly historic moment, and there are very important figures associated with that moment, and we are all very keen to hear her. So without further ado, a very warm welcome to Rosinka Di, Professor Chaudhary, and I would invite you to take stage. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Madhumita, for inviting me. Thank you, Orko, for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to see people here that I haven't seen in a while. Apart from Madhumita and Orko, of course, who I knew would be here. I can see Parimala. I can not see, but I can see that they're there, Ravindra and Shomdatta. So I'm very happy that I will be speaking to friends, and that this will be like a sort of small conversation between people who are here because they have some sort of interest in the work. Omyoda, okay. I didn't. Yes, so that makes my day. So now that I know that I have these 3 or 4. It makes my day and makes me slightly nervous as well, but that's always a good feeling at the beginning of a talk. These are people who really know the area that I'm going to be speaking on. So they're obviously here out of interest for the research area, and I'm very glad to be speaking to all of you today. So without further ado, I will start. I don't have a PowerPoint or images. There's no way to keep you awake apart from with my words. So I do hope that this will hold your attention. I'll start. The first section of this paper that I have titled for the purposes of today, Civil and Political Liberty and the Happiness of Indians, Calcutta 1843. The first section is called A Den of Treason, and a den of treason is within inverted commas. The historian S.N. Mukherjee had remarked many years ago that in the 19th century, I quote, the political destiny of Bengal was controlled by the British, and no section of the population, within parentheses, with the exception of a small segment of the Bengal Muslim peasantry led by the revivalist Faraidis, was willing or able to challenge the British authority, least of all the Calcutta elite, unquote. Reflective of the typical prejudices of the Bengali Bhadralok historians of the 1970s, the remark conflates popular politics alone with political resistance and misreads the nature of the confrontation generated by the grouping later known as Young Bengal. This group was stigmatized as the elite and for being unrepresentative of the common people, including Muslims, most trenchantly by historians in the 1970s, who were, of course, it would be salutary to remind ourselves, themselves in a similar category in relation to historiography in their own time, after all. Anyway, but this paper will attempt to demonstrate the fallacy of the argument that none were willing or able to challenge British authority by looking closely at the significance of a single incident as it played out in the city of Calcutta in 1843 among the Calcutta elite thus arraigned. So, at a meeting of the Society for the Acquisition of General Knowledge held in the hall of the Sanskrit College on 8th February 1843, around 150 Indians assembled one evening to hear Dakshinaranjan Mukherjee's essay titled The Present State of the East India Company's Criminal Judicature and Police under the Bengal Presidency. Dakshinaranjan was later referred to as a grandson of Babu Shurji Kumar Tagore of Calcutta and a prominent member of the first batch of the Hindu College alumni, whom Mr. James Hume gave the sobriquet of Chakrabarti faction, and who in afterlife distinguished themselves by their patriotic and spirited labors. Hume ran the popular Star newspaper, while Chakrabarti faction was a label, Anglicization of Chakrabarti, of course, used to refer to the group of Hindu college friends that was perceived to have been led by Tarachand Chakrabarti. This group was, of course, later known as Young Bengal. The formation of the SAGK in 1838 by erstwhile members of Derozio's academic association was undoubtedly propelled by fundamental political impulses, I argue, informed by a much more expansive understanding of the grievances of India than was on the agenda of the Landholders' Society, also put in place in 1838 on liberal principles, but only in the interests of those who owned land. Fragments of letters written by Ramgopal Ghosh, one of the founding figures of the SAGK, testify to the broader purpose and political agenda already on the minds of Young Bengal at least 5 years before 1843, when Dakshinaranjan embarked upon his speech in Calcutta. Writing to Govinda Chandra Boshak on plans which I have lately been maturing in conjunction with Mr. Adam, Ramgopal had written, and I'm quoting, "This gentleman, you are perhaps aware, has gone to America with a view to join his family at Boston, and then will go to England, where he will probably be settled in London in connection with the press. I had several interviews with him previous to his departure, and his earnest proposal was that we might set about collecting information which should guide the public and public measures. This can be chiefly done by intelligent and active men like yourself who are placed in the Mufassil. And our government being so apathetic here, the best plan would be to transit this information to Mr. Adam in England, who would bring it prominently forward in the London press and arouse the attention of the English public to Indian subjects." Unquote. This idea to collect information in the Mufassil, that is the rural hinterland, shows an acute awareness that knowledge of the real state of affairs of the country was obtainable only there. Further, to use that information to then supply it as fuel with which to light the flame of political opinion in mainland Britain itself, from where it was anticipated change might be effected bypassing the local government of India. This was a strategy so far not attempted in the country. Petitions and agents had been sent to England preceding this, but an organized effort to rouse public opinion to change the state of the country had not. The subjects that required information for reform to be effected were undoubtedly national in nature, as they were listed by Ramgopal as, and I'm quoting again, the real state of the police and the means of improving it, the Akbari system, its uses and abuses, the cause of the absence of a spirit of enterprise in Bengal and the means of reviving them, is population increasing or diminishing, and what are the causes operating to produce either effect? Is wealth increasing or decreasing? Unquote. Ramgopal Ghosh was a close friend of Dakshinaranjan and would have been expected to be present in the hall when Tarachand, president of the SAGK, was in the chair that evening in February 1843. Apart from the many other Indians in attendance, the principal of the Hindu College, D.L. Richardson, was also present in the hall, although as a guest rather than a member. Only half of the essay could be read out, however, as there was an interruption in the proceedings, such as had never been witnessed before. The Hurkaru printed an extensive report on the proceedings and the sensational developments that followed. The lecture was later reprinted in its entirety in the paper a few days later, and we see it began in Shakespearean style by addressing friends and countrymen. It left out the Romans, obviously. Going on to present a sweeping and general historical overview of how men, once emerged from barbarism, had gone about the business of establishing a system for the security of property and the protection of each individual member of society. Unquote. Much in the manner of the essay titled On the Colonization of India of 1829, about which I've already written elsewhere, which too had generated heated discussion in the press, this essay also had the same broad style, perhaps a convention of essay writing at the time, of presenting an overview of the subject at the start. So every civilized society, it declared, developed codes, and the laws of Manu and Jaggo-Balko were referred to as codes that evidenced an anxiety for the welfare of the people, however their efficacy had been impaired by the arts of priestcraft and the tyranny of conquerors, unquote. Even if in earlier times the sovereign lord, Dakshinaranjan said, had exercised, he said, a patriarchal sway, and I found the use of the word patriarchal interesting here, and so could abuse their power, he went on, quote, the principle of governing for the good of the many, though less vigorously alive, was never lost sight of from the moment that called it into being. In successive generations, all quarters of the globe, he said, had added to this concept. And as, he said, mankind grew more enlightened, popular rights recognized, indeed, but often placed at the mercy of the ruling authority, were better understood, more strictly developed, more strikingly illustrated, and more successfully defended. At this day, he asserted, the principle of equal justice in the administration of government is universally received and almost universally admitted, at least in theory and profession, if not in actual practice. Governments, he reminded his audience, are for the good of the many and not of the few. We see the phrase popular rights being used here, perhaps for the first time in Indian national discourse, an event of no mean significance, even if the speaker recognizes that it was a concept more extant in theory and profession, words that appeared in italics in the report the next day, as indeed did the words equal justice. Now, complaints about the nature and operation of the law in relation to the principles of equal justice had been growing at this time. Tarachand Chakraborty, chairman of this SAGK meeting in February 1843, when Dakshinaranjan spoke on the current state of the judiciary, was, it should be remembered, a free scholar in the first batch of the Hindu College, well known in his time for his uncompromising standards of self-respect. Perhaps his first encounter with the hollowness of the British judicial system at work in Bengal was when he was penalized by a corrupt European judge, leading to his resignation from his job as Munsif at Hooghly, a lucrative post he had no hesitation in giving up. Moving itinerantly from job to job under the colonial dispensation throughout his career, he was known for his uncompromising temperament, something that might have had a role to play in the strict standards he upheld at the meeting itself as chair. Let us then look at how Dakshinaranjan and Tarachand here were both willing and able to challenge the British authority in a small revolt of enormous significance in the civil sphere at the time. Such an assertion of the principle of equal justice under the law may not have been a physical revolt, but it reverberated with significance in society at the time nonetheless. So Dakshinaranjan pointed out that the British had now been in this part of the country for 80 years. I think he's counting from the Battle of Plassey, 1757. Time enough to establish, he says, a just judicial and police administration upon the people. That, however, had not been done. The essay then went into a detailed indictment of the state of affairs in the interior of the country, where the courts were notoriously and shamelessly corrupt. It cannot be denied, he said, that every man in these courts of the Faujdari Adalat had his price, from the peon up to the sheristadar, further maintaining, as the Hurkaru summarized, I quote, the entire process was one of extortion and corruption in which the weaker and poorer parties invariably went to the wall. It would be at once erroneous and unfair to deny that the lives and property of the natives of India were safer under the East India Company's government than under the rule of their predecessors. But it would at the same time be flattery and an untruth to say that the present system of police was one in which the natives could repose the least confidence. Unquote. Proceeding from here to the character of the Hindu people, their tolerance, their willingness to give shelter to other persecuted peoples such as the Parsis, Dakshinaranjan had just embarked on the motives which had influenced the British coming to these shores when he was interrupted. Captain Richardson had arisen to make an objection, and he now took center stage to deliver a lengthy address, objecting strenuously to the tone and tenor of the proceedings. He expressed paternalistic and benevolent feelings to start with at the growing intelligence exhibited by the rising generation among the native population, and pointed out that he himself had always been a sincere advocate of the cause of native education. He, as we know, he was an illustrious teacher of literature at the Hindu College. The British government, he said, had cheerfully lent its assistance to the promotion of an object so desirable, had cheerfully lent its assistance to the promotion an object of, I'm missing an of here, an object so desirable, the undeniable proof of which was presented in the college, the hall of which was at the moment occupied by the society. The report then conveys a note of surprise and injury. It says, he regretted, that is, Richardson regretted, however, to perceive that the spread of intelligence among the young natives had taken a direction and resulted in efforts contrary to his expectations. It seemed to have led them to look rather upon the faults than the virtues of the company, and to prefer the contemplation of the dark in preference to the bright side of the picture. This opinion had received strength on the present occasion in consequence of the generous sympathy manifested with the remarks that had been made by the young man. And here the paper, the Bengal Hurkaru, adds in brackets referring to Babu Dokhin, meaning Dakshinaranjan. And the warm response which those remarks had apparently awakened in the hearts of the audience, a response which seemed to be unanimous. He had been admiring the essay, Richardson said, as a piece of English composition that showed considerable ability. Nevertheless, he could not sufficiently deprecate the tone and spirit in which the writer had conveyed his sentiments, nor the conclusions which had been stated. These, he felt, had been calculated to create discontent. He would remind the meeting of the security the natives now enjoyed in comparison with the condition of their ancestors under the Mohammedan government. The government was well aware, he said, that the universal spread of knowledge among the natives of India would be fatal to the existence of their power, that is the government's power. Nonetheless, they were still doing all in their power to help the cause of education, that hereafter the people might be qualified to govern themselves. No government was perfect, he went on, warming to his theme with many examples. Were those of France or Russia or Prussia any different? No, and perfection was not to be expected. He himself did not expect the present government of India to be perfect. After all, evils existed under the very best forms of government. Did not robberies, violence, and murders occur in Great Britain as well as in India? As for the abuses of the darogas, he thought those were the fault of the people themselves than of the government. Since life and property were so much more secure now than before, the writer should rather have dwelt upon feelings of gratitude, and those around him might also have concurred. Instead, the essay was a catalogue of the defects of our administration and a strong denunciation of the government under which they lived. The real reason why he was so aggrieved, and the actual cause for his feelings of anguish, it seemed, however, was in perceiving the response which such sentiments had found in the bosoms of those present. And he felt it his duty to use every means to discourage such improper conduct. Finally, and momentously, he came to the crux of his objection. I quote, "To stand up in a hall which the government has erected, and in the heart of a city which was the focus of enlightenment, and there to denounce as oppressors and robbers the men who govern the country, did, in his opinion, amount to treason, And though himself a Whig in sentiment, he could not quietly witness such improper proceedings, more especially on the part of those who either were or had been students of the Hindu College, a noble and estimable institution originated with the government that had been so loudly condemned. The college would never have been in existence but for the solicitude the government felt in the mental improvement of the natives of India. He could not permit it, therefore, to be converted into a den of treason and must close the doors against all such meetings. The paper had emphasized in italics, converted into a den of treason and must close the doors against all such meetings. What followed this denunciation of Dakshinaranjan's speech by so esteemed a person as the principal of the Hindu College in Calcutta, however, still feels unexpected and astonishing in its unfolding. Sedition laws were yet to be formulated and would come into existence only by 1870, to be used thereafter as a tool of suppression by the British right till independence. The first case would come to court only in 1891, only to be revived and reincarnated, as we know, in strength in 21st century India. Instead of the meeting being dispersed and the hall forcibly closed by the authorities, with the police brought in to enforce the orders of those in charge with the help of those in power, the chair, Tarachat Chakraborty, stood up and roundly told off the principal for his conduct. As president of the society and on behalf of my friend Babu Dokhin, I must say, Tarachat Chakraborty asserted, that your remarks are anything but becoming. I am bound also to add, he went on, that I consider your conduct as an insult to the society, and that if you do not retract what you have said and make due apology, we shall represent the matter to the committee of the Hindu College and, if necessary, to the government itself. We have obtained the use of this public hall by leave applied for and received from the committee and not through your personal favor. You are only a visitor on this occasion and possess no right to interrupt a member of this society in the utterance of his opinions. I hope that Captain Richardson will see the propriety of offering an apology to my friend, the writer of the essay, and to the meeting. The reason that I've said that this is astonishing in comparison with current times is if we imagine what would happen if a student today stood up in a government hall and criticized or took to task the current state, for instance, of the judiciary in India, which too can be similarly arraigned or similarly criticized. Any criticism is dealt with in a manner that the criticism could be dealt with in this manner, with the president of the student body standing up and telling the principal of the college that he had no right to speak in this way and that he should apologize, seemed to me in 2021 to be really astonishingly brave in comparison to our own times. Richardson at first refused to either apologize or retract his opinions, and Dakshinaranjan then took the stand again and made his feelings on the matter clear. The chairman was quite right, he felt, and only discharging his duty in calling Richardson to order, as the latter's severe remarks were quite contrary to all the rules of such meetings, saying that the discourse was not half finished. There was no justification for Richardson to have interrupted him in such a way, considering his presence in the hall was only because a member must have invited him to come along and he was just a visitor. The society did not habitually find fault with the British government, Dakshinaranjan continued, unless there were faults of an obvious and injurious character and forced themselves upon their notice. Bestowing what he was calling the boon of education, Dakshinaranjan felt, could not be a reason why the failure of the administration should be concealed, and those who had received an education be prevented from exposing errors and pointing out the remedies required. He wasn't comparing the British and Muslim governments, he said, as it was not fair to judge one according to the doings of the other. No, he judged the British nation according to their own religion and their professed principles. Refuting Richardson's outrageous suggestion, he also emphatically pointed out that the people of India were in no way answerable for the acts of the Darogas, as they were not responsible for placing them in power. Further, the fact that the audience present was sympathizing in the wrongs that is done to their countrymen should surely have been a matter for rejoicing. If the people here believed that the people of England wished them not to suffer the many evils they now endured, then how was that disloyalty? Pertinently, Dokinaranjan also now took objection to Richardson's repeated assertions that it was at the government's initiative that the Hindu college had been established. He did not deny that the government had erected the hall where they were assembled, that is, of the Sanskrit college, nor that they had contributed to the support of the Hindu college, whose students were the ones assembled here. But he said that the college itself owed its origins to the government and would have had no existence without it, was contrary to fact, he said. However, most crucially, the effort which brought it into existence and its support for many years was wholly independent of the government, he pointed out, and therefore greater credit had been claimed for the government than was due. Dokinaranjan could not have had access at this time to the correspondence of Chief Justice Hyde East in 1816, detailing the British reluctance to establish the Hindu College, or known of the persuasion employed to nudge him and the government to move forward in this regard. As we know, it was Indian money that established the Hindu College in 1817. Rather, his forceful statement may perhaps have been based on a previous controversy in the city in 1830 that he had been a witness to, regarding a proposal by the authorities to have portraits painted of Sir Edward Hyde East and H.H. Wilson as a memorial to their legacy of work on behalf of the country. East's portrait, painted in England and brought here to Calcutta, was accompanied by a plaque that proclaimed him as the original founder and initiator of the Hindu College. College alumni had come together at the time to organize protest meetings, at the end of which they reached a decision to have a portrait of David Hare painted at their own initiative. The letter they sent Hare at the time, on the 17th of February 1831, was signed by Dokinaranjan and 564 other young native gentlemen, so that it was recorded for posterity that, quote, however your eminent services to this country may be overlooked by others, they are appreciated by those who have experienced their advantages. This is what the students wrote in their letter to Hare. The next section is called Popular Rights, Public Opinion, and Justice for All Classes. Dokinaranjan's articulation of the reasons he felt it his duty to indict the wrongs done to his countrymen by those in power were unequivocally expressed. Their object, he said, in exposing existing abuses was to obtain redress from the supreme rulers of the country, who, while ignorant of their nature and extent, could afford them no relief. Here, once again, he was not just taking recourse to, but putting in place in powerful rhetoric the dominant mode of redress in Indian politics throughout the 19th century. It was only free discussion, he said, and fearless exposure, not silence, that would save the country to the British by leading them to establish justice for all classes. Every fact contained in the essay he was willing to substantiate, he said, and if these constituted, he said, quoting Richardson, a catalogue of crimes, then the fault in that would not be his, but theirs to whom the crimes were attributable. For Richardson was wrong, he said, in assuming, as he had, that, quote, the government of India and that of England was the same. Such was not the fact. The East India Company were leaseholders whose tenure expires in 11 years, and during that time are constantly subject to the control of Parliament, that Parliament in its turn under the paramount influence of the public opinion of England. There was no rebellion here, he said. Rather, there was faith in the supreme authority, and it was his duty to point out the defects of those in power, who were answerable to those who appointed them. If, he said, to mention the notorious violations of recorded promises on the part of the authorities in India were an offense, surely the violation of public faith itself must be an offense of still greater magnitude. He was no enemy to British rule, nor to any other rule that was upright and impartial. He would say with Pope, he said, quoting Pope, for forms of government let fools contest, whate'er be best administered is best, unquote. As we can see, there is no demand for freedom here. Free discussion and fearless exposure, he said, would save the country to the British. So he's not asking for the British to leave. This is not the freedom movement. That is not what I'm arguing. What he is arguing, rather, is that the British establish over here justice for all classes. British rule was good so long as that aim was accomplished. All classes of people needed access to justice, which the present system denied. You remember he had said it is the poorer people who have no access to justice. This, accompanied by the appeal to the supreme rulers of the country, in whom they had every faith, has been interpreted as a sign of fealty and tribute to the ruling British by embarrassed later historians. Undoubtedly, British rule was perceived to be an improvement on the Nawabi era by these people, this being a sentiment firmly first put in place by Ram Mohan Roy. However, it is my contention that the thinking here has evolved since Ram Mohan's time, and the position taken by Young Bengal is a little thornier than that professed by Ram Mohan. So I'm trying to trace a sort of a movement in the political thinking uh, of the time in Calcutta, in India. The most crucial component of the political scene in the capital of the British Empire in India in the 1820s and 30s, all historians have acknowledged, was the undeniable allegiance of all of civil society in Calcutta towards their rulers. Radical or conservative, progressive or orthodox, every citizen at this time, from Ram Mohan Roy onward, understood that they were subjects who functioned under a ruler. There is no notion of demanding democratic rights here, although there is by now a healthy understanding of representation. For instance, on the issue that the civil service should employ more Indians. But they were very far from any notion that the people should rule themselves. The fact that the people existed under a ruler was taken for granted. A look at the map of India at this time would show the British sun rising further and further in the sky of empire as the century progressed. In Delhi, Bahadur Shah Zafar was still the nominal emperor. The Deccan had been ruled until quite recently by the Peshwas till 1818, but after the British victories in the Second and Third Anglo-Maratha Wars, their rule was so secure that the Raja of Satara was still petitioning them at this time in 1843 for a return of his empire, for a restitution of his rights. In the Punjab, Ranjit Singh Ji had died just 4 years before this in 1839, and his empire, though still in Sikh hands, was in terminal decline. Awadh, once glorious under its Nawabs, had also been ceding ground for a while, and it was only the intractable Afghans that the British had retreated before in a ruinous war led by Lord Ellenborough that very year in 1843, leaving Dost Muhammad on the throne. Apart from these princely states, territories such as the Bengal, Madras, and Bombay presidencies, which were vast presidencies encompassing sort of many of the provinces of India as they exist now, were ruled directly by the British East India Company Private Limited. In Bengal, since the Battle of Plassey, the subsequent years saw the increasingly attenuated puppet Nawabs of Bengal being gradually replaced by the turn of the century with the reality of being governed by a corporation such as the East India Company, an absolutely unprecedented development in the history of the world, as Dalrymple has recently argued, as we know. It was only now in the 1830s and 40s, however, after Ram Mohan had died in distant Bristol in 1833, while on his mission to meet the highest authorities, and indeed the king himself, to argue a case for the Emperor of Delhi, as well as convey the wants of his countrymen, which some felt he had not in fact done adequately, that a growing awareness was manifesting itself in Bengal. The inhabitants of the city, often in alliance with non-official Europeans, began to comprehend the fact that this rule of the East India Company was a different bag of tricks from the old monarchies, and that their whims and actions in Calcutta were not the be-all and end-all of the matter. From the time of the mammoth meetings in 1829 and the active mobilizations preceding and following the renewal of the Charter Act in 1833, aiming to smash company monopoly and argue a case for free trade, the city had witnessed the effectiveness of mass campaigning in Britain and in India. The massive turnouts in Calcutta had been represented in the newspapers as an important development because they showed the authorities in England the views of the inhabitants of the city, which therefore now gained a particular importance. This representation had in fact been effective, and the Charter Act of 1833 had bowed to many of the demands made by the free trade lobbies. I've traced all of this in my in the paper that I mentioned on the colonization of India of where I've discussed this paper of 1829 by a Hindu college student at the time. Anyway, but this representation from the city in 1833 had been effective. And the city had seen this and witnessed this. Another hard-fought political gain at this time, as we know, again well known, was the freedom of the press, pushed through by interim Governor General Charles Metcalfe in 1835 after a relentless campaign in civil society, which had benefited both financially and otherwise from substantial contributions made by the native community. In the realm of ideas, on the other hand, faraway ideas, the impact of the French Revolution on young Bengal has often been commented upon, but I'd like to underline the intriguing use of the word happiness by members of this group that seem to point toward the famous clause in the American Declaration of Independence that mentioned the pursuit of happiness. Launching their famous rationalist paper, The Enquirer, on 17th of May 1831, 7 months before Derozio died and while still in their teenage years, the editor Krishnamohan Bandopadhyay had declared, "Having thus launched our bark under the denomination Enquirer, we set sail in quest of truth and happiness." A decade later, in 1841, at the foundation of the Desh Hitoshini Sabha, another member of this Hindu college group, Sharoda Prasad Ghosh, was more pointed in his observation that, I quote, "Our deprivation of the enjoyment of political liberty is the cause of our misery and degradation. The losses of happiness follow the losses of civil liberty, as shadow does the substance. This is a principle which has been received as an axiom of political science." Unquote. Within a couple of years of that speech, now in 1843, the political rhetoric of young Bengal had moved to the position that if this East India Company government was corrupt and oppressive, then redressal could be sought from the supreme authority. But interestingly, and this is the new development in this time, that supreme authority, it seems, did not rest in the person of the King of Britain, but resided rather in the body of the people of Britain and public opinion there, which framed the parliament which governed India. More independent minded than both earlier as well as later subjects of empire of the latter half of the century, young Bengal's political position constituted demands that were new in their time. Investigating the relationship between law, religion, and universality in this period, Rahul Govind has pointed out that Ram Mohan Roy has either been described as the first Indian liberal and a maker of modern India, or on the other hand, as one who could bring about little more than a caricature of promised transformation. But that Ram Mohan saw himself as a subject of the English king, however, is much less analyzed. Govind shows that not only did Ram Mohan appeal to George IV as a British subject in his address to the King in Council, even in his letter to the heir apparent of the Mughal throne, he made it clear that he was a Mughal envoy only as a British subject. By 1843, however, young Bengal, arguing for political liberty, had shifted the goalposts, appealing rather to public opinion, which could move Parliament as the final arbiter, rather than to the person of the King of England. The understanding was that they were equal subjects of the British Empire, as Ram Mohan too would have argued perhaps. But the manner in which they defended their right to fair treatment in both civil and political matters had changed significantly, as we can see from the way in which they faced down charges of treason in a remarkable manifestation of the fighting spirit that created shockwaves in the print and public sphere of the capital city of the British Empire in India in 1843. Public opinion was now emphasized as all important, for it was public opinion that would move the British Parliament on the issues of wrongs committed by the company officials and its appointed government officials in India. Daksinaranjan referred to the East India Company as leaseholders whose tenure expires in 11 years, referring to when the Charter Act would come up for renewal in 1854. Like the Nawabs in Bengal functioning under the emperor in Delhi not so long ago, these company officials and their civil servants were, after all, no more than local satraps under the emperor in Britain. But these were not the old feudal satraps bowing before an authoritarian king. No, even during that time when they were no more than leaseholders, he reminded Richardson, the rulers of India, the EIC, that is the East India Company, were, he said, quote, constantly subject to the control of Parliament, and that Parliament, in its turn, under the paramount influence of the public opinion of England. The repercussions of this incident were felt for some time to come. The friend of India and the Englishman exploded in fury at the proceedings as they had been reported in the Hurkaru in the following days. On the 16th of February, 10 days after this meeting, the friend of India alluded particularly to the declamation of Babu Dokhina Mukherjee, in which he poured the vials of his indignation on this unfortunate government and charged it with having repeatedly violated engagements the most solemn in the very hall which that government had erected for the encouragement of native education. Further, it felt that, and I'm quoting, these are all quotations, in any other colonial possession but that of Great Britain, this language would have been punished as seditious. Such a speech at Batavia or Samarang would have ensured the speaker, as the mildest punishment, transportation to Amboina. And not 20 years since, a man would no more have dreamt of uttering such sentiments in Calcutta than he would of engaging in a highway robbery. The best general answer to the objections brought by him against this arbitrary, this perfidious government is the fact that he is allowed to abuse it with such perfect impunity in its own metropolis. Unquote. The charges Dokkhina Ranjan had laid out against the judiciary, the police, and the courts were discussed by the paper, that is the Friend of India, only to conclude that, this is from the Friend of India, I'm quoting, the remedy of the existing evils lay more in the hands of the people than of the government. That if public opinion in the circle of native society be once enlisted on the side of truth, honesty, and justice, the defects of the European functionaries, and they are by no means few, will be little felt. Unquote. So they deflected the blame from the government to the people of India. The people of India were themselves to blame for the current situation. The Hurkaru, however, took a non-partisan approach to the matter in its reports, and it defended young Bengal from the charges of abuse and seditious language. So it's interesting to see, even within the expatriate Englishmen in India who are running these newspapers, the different political positions that the newspaper editors are taking. So the Hurkaru said, and I'm quoting, "We could easily refer to numerous meetings in the town hall of Calcutta, attended by the oldest and most intelligent natives, as well as by the most eminent Europeans, unconnected with the government, distinguished by even greater warmth of temper and strength of language than anything exhibited at the meetings now being held," it proclaimed. Why then should the junior members of society be held more accountable or expected to be more perfect than men of much greater experience and advantages? It asked. Rather than take them to task, it advocated instead that, quote, "we rejoice in the symptoms of awakening patriotism." Importantly for Indian history, incidents such as the one I have described comprised an upheaval in the civic fabric that demonstrates how a manner of speaking and a rhetoric of argument were put in place with regard to methods of political work for the first time in 1843. These modes of argument, I would argue, were subsequently used by all shades of political activists in the country throughout the 19th century, including the Indian National Congress when it was formed in cooperation between A.O. Hume and Indian leaders in 1885. The original aim of the Congress, we have to remember, was to obtain a greater share in government for educated Indians and to create a platform for civic and political dialogue between them and the British Raj. Objectives uncannily similar to young Bengals in the month of February 1843. So my basic question then is, if we acknowledge the role of the Indian National Congress, or if we acknowledge the role of the Indian Association and Surendranath Banerjee, why do we not acknowledge the role of this group, Young Bengal, as they articulated their grievances in 1843? I'll come to the last. Am I running seriously out of time? Are we doing okay for time?
We are fine. We are fine, Rosinka. Please go ahead.
Okay. So the concluding section is called Understanding Liberty. When Tarachand Chakraborty stood up in the Sanskrit College Hall to rebuke the principal of the Hindu College, a move unilaterally supported by the considerable numbers present there, he was asserting the liberty to speak freely. Freedom of speech had been defended in the city since the time of Ram Mohan Roy in the context of a free press. That was a battle fought right from the closure of John Silk Buckingham's Calcutta Journal and Ram Mohan Roy's Miratul Akbar and Buckingham's ultimate summary deportation from Calcutta in 1823 onward. This is well documented. We know, I'm just rehearsing. Most historians of 19th century India are very familiar with this. A petition had then been submitted, and they had asked for a repeal of the Adam Regulations of 1823. And then Lord Metcalfe, who had taken over from Bentinck, managed in the single year that he officiated as head of government to succeed more fully than others before him ever had, by acting in accordance with his recorded view that the press ought to be free, for which then he earned the long-standing gratitude of the city. The magnificent premises of the Metcalfe Hall, built overwhelmingly with native money, still stands as a testimony to his defense of the right of Indians to a free press. Macaulay, in drafting a minute for Metcalfe's Press Act, had also mentioned liberty, arguing that, I'm quoting Macaulay, it is acknowledged that in reality, liberty ought to be the general rule and restraint the rare and temporary exception, unquote. The conceptual premises of liberty in the 19th century cannot be discussed without recourse to James and his son John Stuart Mill's writings. In 1823, the same year that Buckingham was deported and the Adam Regulations came into effect, James Mill had obtained for John an appointment under himself at the India House, a position that the younger Mill would occupy for the next 35 years, without, again like his father, any knowledge of contemporary India itself, or the limited demand for liberty made by the educated classes there at this time. Lynn Zasterpool has shown how, quote, important parallels exist between his development as a thinker and his neglected India, his meaning she's referring to John Stuart Mill, his neglected India House career from the surviving documents, challenging the notion that his work there was not central to John Stuart Mill's intellectual life. But even if she uses archival evidence to show how important India might have been to the shaping the flow of British intellectual life, because, she says, Mill matured as a person and a thinker in the context of Indian administration, the question I'm asking remains, what was the India that either of the Mills knew from their lifelong work at India House? The two Mills, Zastopoulos concedes, held to a conventional representation of a primitive India that needed to be remade after the model of advanced Europe, even if theoretically they did not believe the two societies were irremediably different, as all cultures, they believed, shared common as well as plural human realities like joy, suffering, and political organization, unquote. Javed Majid claims in Ungoverned Imaginings that William Thomas attributes J.S. Mill's preoccupation with backward and progressive social states in his political writings to the influence of his father's history. James Mill had remarked in 1813, quote, grant in any quarter of the globe a reading people and a free press, and the prejudices on which misrule supports itself will gradually and silently disappear, unquote. John Stuart Mill, following his father in Bentham, had maintained a solidarity throughout for what he saw as the utilitarians' long radical tradition of an almost unbounded confidence in the efficacy of two things, representative government and complete freedom of discussion. But crucially, these beliefs held true for both the Mills only for their own enlightened regions, not for the colonies. Although Bentinck brought these beliefs in the 1830s to India in a genuine attempt to marry two irreconcilables, despotism and enlightened government. James Mill had asserted that cultures were better understood from a distance. Sympathy with Indian culture negated the possibility of a comprehensive view, and he was clear that India not only could but should be studied from a distance. Mill was critical of scholars like William Jones, for, he said, the fond credulity with which the state of society among the Hindus was for a time regarded by Jones, despite the fact that, as Javed Majid points out, quote, ironically, although Mill defined his position against Jones, his position is reliant on the latter's insofar as he could not form any stance on Indian cultures without using the translations of Jones and his colleagues. What Majid doesn't point out, however, is that it is even more ironical that there is a basic contradiction in the philosophy itself. If, as Bentham had formulated and James Mill had believed, the past was of no account in the task of the reform of institutions, then it followed that India in its present state, and not through the lens of the Orientalists who were fixated on ancient glories, was what needed to be understood. John Stuart Mill's dispatches and published writings show, for instance, his beliefs such as that the Rajputs were the ancient ruling class of India, or that Awadh was a Muslim state, or that the Maratha rulers were mere adventurers, or that certain groups of Brahmins were the natural leaders of Indian public opinion. These were, opinions that are there in the published writings of John Stuart Mill. Now, one could, as the poet Kashi Prasad Ghosh, encouraged by H.H. Wilson, did, critique either he critiqued James Mill, or one can critique John Stuart Mill. You can critique either of them for their disregard of the Indian pre-colonial past. Or, as Majid has done, you can criticize them for their disregard of the British past and its invocations. But whether the Mills disregarded the Indian past or the British past, how did their ignorance of the colonial present impact their argumentation? Both Majid and Zastupil are in the end aiming to show the impact of India through the Mills on British intellectual and political thought. That is their main arena of investigation. Lynn Zastupil wants to show the effect Rammohun Roy had on England, and Majid is also trying to show the impact that the India archives, so the India House work had on Mill's understanding of British intellectual thought. So what I am asking is, what happens to the radical utilitarian sense of disbelief that arguments of precedence had any weight when considering the nature of institutions and their effect on human happiness, if their entire argumentation on India was based on a misunderstanding of contemporary India, that is, contemporary India in their time? Rammohun Roy may have met with Bentham in London and impressed him, but the utilitarians were allowed famously to see India as a tabula rasa, blank pages on which to execute their theories, not just by a misreading of the Indian past, by a blindness to the India of their own times. More than the past even, it was the Indian present which was in fact the tabula rasa, an empty civil sphere where changes could be effected based on a notion of education which believed society could be remodeled on rational principles. Majid shows this belief to be sourced in Mill's authoritarianism, elements which were later developed by the younger Mill. John Stuart Mill did not know it when writing On Liberty, but young Bengal had already contested, in the social sphere at least, as far as and beyond what was practicable, the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. Unquote. On Liberty would be published by John Stuart Mill in full form only in 1869, after its first manifestation in 1854. And although its principal concern, a new problem emerging in democracies, tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling, was not yet in the air in Bengal, its larger spheres of concern, civil or social liberty, was in some sense already in the atmosphere here. When Mill articulates in that text that liberty connotes, I'm quoting Mill, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. He is progressing from liberty of conscience to liberty of expression of belief as an integral element of what it is to have liberty of conscience and liberty of action arising from and expressive of belief. What was being argued for in the hall of the Sanskrit College was no less. Tarachand and Dakshinaranjan, in asserting their rights, were making a powerful case for liberty of thought and discussion and for the proper limits of state authority. This argument for civil and political liberty, made powerfully in the halls of the Sanskrit College on an evening in February 1843 in Calcutta, had a significant outcome politically. Outraged at this interference in their rights, the meeting had concluded that day with Dakshinaranjan expressing the opinion that after what has occurred, it will be impossible to continue our meetings in this hall, and we must go where we will not be at the mercy of a single individual. The search for new premises for the SAGK meetings were not easy given the urgency of the matter, and it took almost a month for the venue to shift on the 6th of March 1843 to a hall above the dispensary at number 31, Faujdari Balakhana. It was here, a little more than a month later, on the 20th of April 1843, that the first political party formed in India, the Bengal British India Society, came into existence. The story of the formation and the activities of the society, it would be fair to say, have received little or no attention at all in history writing. And that's a separate story, which I will not be, of course, going into over here. Rarely acknowledged as the first Indian political association or as being the progenitor of all Indian political associations that followed, it can be seen from a close examination of the formation of this society that it put in place, in fact, the method and manner of political agitation as it existed throughout the 19th century in India. As we have seen, what was being argued for in 1843 was no longer just liberty in the form of freedom of the press, but more broadly, freedom of speech, the right to assemble, to protest, to criticize, and to demand justice. The British philosophical radicals and the Chartists in Britain had been arguing at this time for representative democracy in the form of near universal suffrage, the secret ballot, and frequent, if not annual, parliaments in Britain itself. And we must remember that they failed in that endeavor. Here in Calcutta, the Indian ultra radicals would have been well aware of those demands, but they were not making such demands for themselves. Such ideas remained in the theoretical domain for them, rather than in the domain of cognizable action in the here and now. What was being fought for by the vanguard in Calcutta, rather, were the smaller battles rather than the larger war, the removal of particular grievances, not the greater fight of larger changes to the polity. While recognizing that fact, it would still be important, this paper has argued, to acknowledge the enormous significance of the debates generated at this time for the shape of the Indian modern as it was being put into place. For the tools that were being used now to achieve change, as we have seen, were essentially modern political tools and are still in use. Thank you very much. Thank you.